When it comes to the field of video game history, Sega are often championed for the many innovative game consoles they brought to the table. The Sega Mega Drive was once the most popular gaming platform in the world in many regions. The Dreamcast was at one point the most powerful system money could buy, and in a variety of ways the Game Gear with its full colour display made the Game Boy look like a baby's toy. As impressive as many of these magical machines were, what has always been even more interesting to me is that beyond Sega's cornucopia of consoles that saw retail releases, are a plethora of platforms that were announced and heavily talked about which never hit store shelves. In today's video we are going to be looking back at the legacy of one of these phantom systems, the role it played in hardware history, and ultimately why the gaming public were deprived of this delightful device. So without further ado, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of the unreleased Sega Neptune. Yeah. In order to tell this week's tale, let's set the scene. We are approaching the mid-1990s and the most entertaining console war in gaming's journey is in full swing. Nintendo and Sega are competing against each other head to head in the 16-bit market, and we are on the cusp of the industry changing forever once more with the release of the Sony PlayStation. To call this era for console gaming significant would be an understatement. Prior to the PlayStation taking its throne, many companies were trying to create the leading consoles that would supersede the 16-bit generation, with the likes of the Atari Jaguar, 3DO and Amiga CD32 being amongst the most powerful consoles that would arrive and fail. Sega on the other hand, who was currently making a huge impact with the Mega Drive, had a range of ideas with regards to how they would position themselves and leap towards the future. Of course, their first notable step releasing something beyond their basic cartridge-based 16-bit platform was with the creation of the Sega Mega CD, a system add-on for the Mega Drive that allowed it to play CD games, along with adding hardware functionality such as a faster CPU and graphic enhancements such as sprite scaling and rotation, along with the additional bonus of playing both audio CDs and CD plus G discs. This add-on came out in Japan as early as December of 1991, however it was designed more to counter the capabilities of the competing PC Engine CD-ROM system, taking advantage of CD-based media's higher storage capacity, rather than to usher in a new generation of gaming entirely. By 1994, the Mega CD, or Sega CD as it's known in North America, was deemed to have underperformed. Sega of America president Tom Kalinske blamed the device's lack of popularity on the add-on's high price for limiting its potential market. Sega attempted to add value in the US and the UK by bundling more games, but the CD-based contraption never quite had the impact intended. Past this point, competitive pricing would continue to be an element that Sega of America would factor in when making decisions regarding the hardware's future, with it also being noted that a number of 32-bit systems created by competing companies had never caught on, partially due to their balmy price points. Last week on this channel, for example, I noted that when taking inflation into account, the 3DO interactive media player cost 3 times as much as the PS5 on its launch day, so players' budgets needed to be heavily considered in order to get consumers to make the jump. Due to the Genesis console's already huge install base, in November of 1994 Sega would release the 32X. Earlier that year, back in June, it had been presented at a consumer electronics show as a low-cost budget option for those who wanted to get into 32-bit gaming who didn't want to pay the insane prices that are expected elsewhere. As we now know, the 32X plan would end up backfiring even worse than the Sega CD one, in part due to failing to attract many third-party developers and consumer interest due to the announcement of the Saturn's simultaneous release in Japan, Sega's true next-generation system. So that's where the Mega Drive, Mega CD, Sega 32X and Saturn all fit into this puzzle. But what for the mysterious Neptune that would also be hyped up during this somewhat experimental period for gaming? Thankfully, as all of this was unfolding, a number of old gaming magazines were regularly reporting on the developing story around this now largely forgotten system, so we can therefore go back and see what this thing was all about. In February of 1995, Next Generation magazine would report that sources inside Sega have confirmed that a combined Genesis 32X unit was planned for release later that same year, taking the codename Project Neptune. They would state that if their sources were to be trusted, it would retail for under $200, with them stating that such a move would not come as a surprise to gamers considering how many console variants Sega were known to make. The article adds the decision to keep the Neptune cartridge based is reaffirmation of both Sega's faith in the cartridge as a viable data storage medium in an increasingly CD orientated world, and the Sega CD's continued failure to come up with truly groundbreaking software. It would seem that Sega CD development has been sidelined by Sega, with the company's key development resources aimed at the still profitable Genesis market and the imminent Saturn. The journalist who covered this story also mentioned to expect a price reduction of the 32X when the Neptune hits the market, with the add-on likely dipping below the sub $100 mark. Building on this, they speculate that many gamers may see the 32X price reduction as unfair based on the price they would have just paid for it. But those same fans shouldn't accuse Sega of anything other than following the standard pricing practices for new hardware platforms, and to look to the 3DO if they really wanted to look at poor customers who paid out for an $800 console that was reduced to $400 fast. They conclude that 32X owners' real concern should be with regards to how good the 32X's library gets, essentially alluding to the fact that if the standalone Neptune is a success, that it would only benefit original 32X owners. As for their summarisation of the Neptune, they would call it yet another descendant of the Genesis set to launch in 1995 following the Wonder Mega and CDX, the Genesis CD combos. Neptune will incorporate 32X's twin Hitachi 32-bit chips and retail for a Jaguar challenging $200. A further old magazine scan further backs up what we know about the Neptune, with it being described as a new, sleek, ergonomically designed combination unit, and the first system to integrate both 16 and 32-bit technology for less than $200. Designed to provide the ultimate gameplay experience, the system gives consumers the option to play all of Sega's extensive library of 16 and 32-bit video games, without having to purchase the two systems separately. This 2-in-1 package utilises the same raw power as the Genesis and 32X adapter. In addition, with the Sega CD, consumers can play the Sega CD titles, making the Genesis 32X system the first and only 16 and 32-bit plus CD video game platform on the market. The Genesis 32X system will ship early next fall. Speaking of the Neptune, if none of this is enough evidence for you to back up its existence, the system would even show up in a product catalogue with its own barcode. In the catalogue, it would be advertised as the Genesis 32X system is a Genesis and 32X adapter combined. Now you can bring home a next generation system that has the same power and game experience as the quarter-munching machine at the mall. 40 times faster than 16-bit machines, 32,768 colours, compatible with Genesis controllers, suggested retail price below $200, it will be Sega CD compatible, supported by a strong marketing campaign, and be available as of winter of 1996. So things were looking very promising indeed for this awesome little piece of gaming technology, but it would not be long until disaster struck. By as early as January of 1996, the Neptune's release was already cancelled, with Next Generation magazine reporting Sega cans the Neptune, realising the price of the machine would be too close to Saturn to tempt many, and is also wary of diluting the Saturn marketing message. In order to fully understand Neptune's cancellation, it becomes incredibly clear why the idea was axed, simply by looking at console pricing in 1996. The previous year had presented us with one of the iconic E3 events, whereby Sega of America's CEO, Tom Kalinske, revealed that the Saturn console would be released immediately to select retailers at a price of $399, with, shortly afterwards, Sony's Steve Race coming to the conference stage announcing that the PlayStation would be launched at only $299. This fierce pricing war, that was clearly having an impact on who was controlling the largest market segment, led to both consoles being made even cheaper by 1996. The PlayStation would be reduced to just $199, with Sega being forced to follow suit and make the Saturn $199 as well, even though Saturn hardware was much more expensive to manufacture. Sega could not have had the Sega Neptune as their budget option when they were already being forced into a corner whereby they had to sell the Saturn itself at a low-end price. Like the 3DO before it, the Saturn was on sale at half of its intended retail price after just a year. Thankfully, despite the Sega Neptune remaining unreleased, its story and legacy was far from over quite yet, as a number of incidents have occurred over the years that have allowed this mostly forgotten platform's history to be built on. The first time the Neptune would make the news again would not be until 2001, when it appeared in the news that a number of units had been discovered in a warehouse and would be going up for sale to collectors at $50 a pop. The source of this story stemmed from a now defunct website known as SegaNeptune.com, but sadly would transpire to be no more than an amusing April Fool's joke. As cruel as this hoax was, no one can deny that it added to the mystique and intrigue around the mysterious machine. While the warehouse incident may not have been true, thankfully the Neptune that had previously appeared in all of those magazine photographs from the past would eventually show back up. The object from the photos would show up in the hands of the National Videogame Museum, a US-based entity operating today from Frisco, Texas. With the history dating back to 1999, a small group of individuals would host the first Classic Gaming Expo in Las Vegas, an event that paid tribute to the game industry's people and systems of yesteryear. Morphing into a travelling exhibition, they have displayed their classic games and systems at trade conventions such as E3 and the Game Developers Conference. The National Video Game Museum has now had a permanent location since 2016, whereby amongst the attractions, the Sega Neptune can be seen. There are rumours online that the Sega Neptune made it into the wild through a former Sega employee known as Clint Dyer. Posts can be found on forums from users claiming that they got prototypes directly from Clint, with them also making the claim that Clint told them he would take old items home rather than letting Sega simply throw them in the bin. Regarding whether or not there is any truth to this story, further evidence is collaborated on a website known as NintendoPlayer.com. In an article about Sonic Crackers, an early prototype of Knuckles Chaotix, the page comments that between 1993 and 1996, Dyer worked in the marketing department at Sega and contributed screenshots and media to magazines, meaning he could very well be the person who submitted the Neptune images to these old publications. It also adds that, according to a prototype collector named Adam Harvey, Dyer had a history of picking from the trash while working at Sega. He found and later sold Sega handheld system mock-ups and a mock-up of the Sega Neptune, which could be seen at the 2011 E3 convention. Respected prototype dealer Jason Wilson even claimed that Dyer had sold a few Sonic Crackers in the past. "Mine came from Clint Dyer, who worked at Sega for many years," Wilson said. "And if it came from me through him, I can assure you it is genuine." After publishing this article, the writer was later contacted by an individual by the alias of Robert S., who would build on this story, stating that incidentally, Clint told me that when he was at Sega, he ended up with the desk of the guy who was responsible for the 32X. Not sure of his name now, but the failure of the 32X was the reason for his termination. In that desk were some interesting bits of prototype hardware. A Venus, later the Nomad, with a very different battery hookup than the production model, and the Neptune mock-up. The Venus ended up with Sean Kelly, the Neptune mock-up went to Tom Keller, and later to John Hardy. Hardy was one of the founders of Classic Gaming Expo, along with Kaita Leader. And I think the mock-up currently is part of the permanent CGE display, which of course now has morphed into the National Video Game Museum. As for the almost mythical object that allegedly Clint Dyer placed in their possession, according to the display at the museum at least, it reads, Sega announced this combo Genesis 32X combo but never delivered. As exciting as it seems to see it in real life, we're sorry to say that the prototype is nothing more than a sculptured piece of plastic. There's no circuitry inside. It is believed that this very unit was for actual mock-up shown at trade shows. While a working Neptune prototype has never been found, it is interesting to see how far Sega got along with the project, and how much information there is out there that can be pieced together to form a picture about this strange period in gaming history. If for some reason Sega did intend to release the Neptune back in the day, I guess some sort of argument could have been had that it was the ultimate 5th generation cartridge based console, but sadly the Sony PlayStation success paired with Sega's own mistakes through the mid 90s permanently dashed any chance of this actually happening. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, please subscribe, and if you want me to dig into more subjects like this, in the meantime, why not check out my video on why you should buy a 3DO in 2023. Yeah, cheerio.